The wooden crate creaked open under the Louisiana sun. Captain Robert Ellison, a logistics officer of the U.S. Army, leaned over to inspect the confiscated belongings of 23 newly arrived German female prisoners of war. He expected knives, hidden insignia, maybe smuggled code books. What he found instead stopped him cold. Inside were neat bundles of thread, folded fabric scraps, tiny scissors, and sewing needles wrapped in gauze like fragile treasures. "They brought needles to a war," he muttered, half laughing, half bewildered. Around him, soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. The enemy's weapons were thimbles and buttons. It was late 1944, and Camp Ruston had just received its first contingent of female POWs, mostly clerks, radio operators, and nurses from the Wehrmacht's Women's Auxiliary. The Red Cross inspection report noted something curious. Almost all carried personal sewing kits. Many had kept them through capture, transport, and interrogation, as if they were lifelines. These were not women of battlefields, but of the margins. Those who had mended uniforms, bandages, and the fraying fabric of a collapsing Reich. As guards cataloged the items, one young prisoner, Erica Lindner, clutched a tin box of buttons like it was a diary. Inside, a scrap of blue fabric embroidered with her initials. "For when peace returns," she whispered to herself in German. The American interpreter heard it but said nothing. The phrase lingered, peace sewn into a war she had not chosen. That first night, the barracks smelled faintly of machine oil and cotton. Outside, searchlights carved sharp lines across the camp fence. But inside, the women huddled over imaginary stitches on their palms, their fingers twitching from habit. They were seamstresses, nurses, telephone clerks, trained to make order out of chaos. Yet here, surrounded by barbed wire, their craft was stripped away, their hands idle. What none of them knew was that this very skill, the ability to repair, to mend, would soon become their salvation. In a world obsessed with destruction, they would rebuild thread by thread. The Americans who once laughed at the contents of that crate would soon realize the irony. The same hands that had supported a war machine were now teaching the victors about humanity's quiet resilience. The hum of sewing machines would soon echo through the camp like a heartbeat, softer than gunfire but infinitely more enduring. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. When the male German prisoners at Camp Ruston were ordered into re-education lectures about democracy and war guilt, the women were sent somewhere else entirely, to a converted mess hall that smelled of starch, cotton, and machine grease. It was there that Captain Ellison and the camp psychologist, Dr. Harold West, began an experiment never mentioned in official handbooks. They replaced propaganda with needlework. According to a 1945 psychological service report from Camp Shanks, handcraft classes used for psychological assessment of German female POWs, doctors discovered something unexpected. Whenever the women's hands were occupied with sewing or embroidery, they began to talk. They spoke of the children they left behind in Dresden, of brothers lost in Russia, of the noise of bombs and the silence that followed. One young signal operator said she used to sew uniforms for soldiers she would later hear die over the radio. It was not a confession. It was therapy without a name. The Americans provided cloth, yarn, and embroidery hoops. The women transformed the dull routine of captivity into a rhythm of motion and sound. Thread pulling through fabric, the low murmur of shared memories, the occasional laughter that startled even themselves. They embroidered flowers on handkerchiefs, initials on towels, small birds on pillowcases. Each piece, in its quiet way, stitched a line between their present captivity and a world that had once been gentle. Dr. West noted in his file, "If you put propaganda in their ears, they close their minds. If you put needles in their hands, they open their hearts." It became the unofficial motto of the program. Guards began calling the building the Room of Talking Hands. Some soldiers stopped by during breaks to watch, fascinated by how silence could dissolve into stories through nothing more than the sound of thread. One prisoner, Nurse Elsa Meyer, wrote in her diary, "I came here hating everything American. Now I look forward to the sewing hours because they smell of home." Her words mirrored a transformation that propaganda could never achieve. The discovery that compassion could exist even behind barbed wire. As weeks passed, the women grew less like inmates and more like workers in a strange factory of memory. Each finished piece was examined, logged, and stored, hundreds of them, like messages never mailed. The difference was invisible but immense. They were no longer being re-educated by force, but by empathy. And as the hum of sewing filled the camp yard, one American sergeant whispered to a colleague, "I think they're teaching us something too." The story began with a torn piece of white nylon found in a pile of army scrap behind the repair depot. It was part of a wrecked parachute, its fabric still smelling faintly of smoke and rain. When a German prisoner named Anneliese Hoffmann saw it, she ran her fingers across the material and whispered, "Fallschirmseide," parachute silk. To her, it was not junk. It was possibility. That afternoon, she gathered 3 other women in the sewing hall: Erika Lindner, the former tailor's apprentice, Lotte Weiss, a field nurse, and Marta Kruger, who used to make wedding gowns in Leipzig before the war. With permission from the American sergeant, they washed the nylon in buckets, hung it across the fence to dry, and watched it flutter in the Louisiana wind like a white ghost above the pine trees. To them, it looked like a truce. From that salvaged silk, they cut panels, measured stitches, and began to shape what would become the first civilian dress ever made inside Camp Ruston. It took 7 days. They sewed at night under the dim light of a single bulb, using thread from Red Cross kits and a hand-crank Singer machine with a missing pedal. The sound of its gears echoed through the quiet camp, each turn marking an act of defiance against everything that had stripped them of womanhood. When the dress was finished, it was breathtaking in its simplicity. Sleeveless, gathered at the waist, the color of morning fog. Anneliese tried it on, barefoot, and for a brief moment, the room fell silent. No one saw a prisoner anymore. They saw a woman standing straight again, her shoulders no longer bent by shame or orders. A museum entry years later, Ruston POW archive, parachute dress, 1945, records the scene. It quotes Anneliese's letter to her sister in Hamburg. "I once feared these parachutes when they brought fire. Now they bring cloth. I have stitched the war into a dress, and when I wear it, I hear peace rustle." That dress became legendary among both guards and prisoners. American nurses would stop by to see it, smiling through the wire. One of them, Private Betty Green, later told the Shreveport Times, "It wasn't just fabric. It was a miracle you could touch." For the women, the parachute dress became a symbol that even wreckage could become something graceful, that destruction could be repurposed into memory. It was not rebellion. It was reclamation. That night, when the sewing hall went dark, the dress hung by the window, faintly glowing under moonlight. Beyond the fence, a train whistle blew, carrying soldiers home, perhaps. Inside, the women watched the fabric move in the wind and realized that, in a world of ashes, beauty was their last act of survival. By early 1945, the women's sewing room had become one of the most disciplined corners of Camp Ruston. What began as idle pastime now produced real work. repairing U.S. Army uniforms, hemming sheets for the infirmary, stitching Red Cross armbands. It started one morning when Sergeant Thomas Reynolds, a guard from Kentucky, brought in his torn jacket. The sleeves had ripped after weeks of duty in the humid Louisiana heat. He handed it to Erica Lindner with an awkward smile and said, "Think you can fix a soldier's pride?" She nodded, took the jacket, and spent an hour pressing every crease until it looked new. That single act changed the atmosphere of the camp. Word spread quickly. The German women could sew better than any quartermaster tailor. Within weeks, the barracks filled with piles of uniforms, each tagged with a name. The women took quiet pride in their work. They ironed out the wrinkles with meticulous care, often humming the same songs they had sung before the war. One of them, a former dressmaker named Marta Kruger, said softly while threading a needle, "If we can mend these coats, maybe we can mend something else too." In Stars and Stripes, a short article appeared that spring. A journalist touring southern POW camps wrote, "The German women at Ruston mend American uniforms with the precision of surgeons." One guard joked that they're healing the war itself. The lines spread like wildfire across military mailrooms, a poetic description of an unlikely truth. That compassion sometimes began with a stitch. But the scene was not entirely serene. Among some of the male German prisoners, jealousy simmered. They mocked the women as dressmakers for the enemy, whispering that they had forgotten where their loyalties lay. When Captain Ellison heard this, he ordered the men to see the sewing room for themselves. The moment they walked in and saw the women working silently, surrounded by folded American flags and clean linen, they said nothing. The hum of the sewing machine drowned out ideology. On one table sat a small sign written in German and English, "Repair, not replace." It had been drawn by one of the younger POWs as a joke, but it became a quiet creed for everyone in the building. Even Sergeant Reynolds kept the repaired jacket as a keepsake, saying he would never trade it for a new one. In the following weeks, more guards began leaving small personal items, torn gloves, handkerchiefs, even baby clothes to be mended. The women never refused. Each piece they touched blurred the boundary between captor and captive just a little more. In a place built for confinement, the act of sewing had opened a door no one could see. Spring 1945 brought a strange stillness to Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The war in Europe was collapsing, but the women inside the POW enclosure felt suspended between two worlds, neither free nor entirely imprisoned. Among them was a 30-year-old woman named Lotte Brenner, formerly a secretary in Germany's Ministry of Transport. She was the one who changed what sewing meant inside those fences. Lotte had perfect penmanship, the elegant looping script of bureaucratic Germany. Yet paper was scarce, and guards strictly limited written correspondence. So she did what she had always done: adapted. She took a piece of linen and with a thin needle and blue thread began to embroider names instead of writing them. Her first line read, "Gefangen, aber nicht vergessen," captured but not forgotten. The words shimmered faintly against the fabric like handwriting made of light. Soon others followed. One woman stitched the date she was captured, December 19th, 1944. Another added a line from Rilke, "Who speaks of victory? To endure is everything." Within weeks, the sewing room walls were draped with dozens of white squares filled with blue script, poems, hometowns, and quiet prayers stitched by trembling hands. The guards were astonished. What had begun as embroidery practice had turned into a living archive. Dr. Helen Carter, a camp psychologist, wrote in her field report, "These women are writing diaries in thread. Each line is both confession and testimony. She allowed them to keep their work, labeling each with date and name. Decades later, the Smithsonian's textile division would catalog them under POW embroidery, 1945, each piece tagged as anonymous art born in captivity. Lotte herself created a long tapestry that listed the names of her fellow prisoners in careful columns, bordered by flowers and the outline of a barbed wire fence. At the bottom, she stitched the words, "Every stitch remembers." To her, the needle was no longer a tool of survival. It had become a pen, writing a history that no censor could erase. When one guard asked her why she spent hours bent over fabric instead of resting, she smiled and said, "Because this is how I speak without permission." That reply stayed with him for years. He mentioned it in a letter to his wife, marveling that one piece of thread can carry more truth than 1,000 reports. To the women, the act of embroidering names was not vanity. It was an act of resurrection. Each stitch declared, "I existed, I mattered, I still have a name." What would you have written if all you had was a needle and a scrap of cloth? In the sewing hall of Camp Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, there was a cracked mirror that leaned against the wall between two Singer machines. Nobody remembered who brought it there. Some said it came from a decommissioned nurse's dormitory. Others claimed a guard salvaged it from a supply truck. But to the German women, it became sacred. Every afternoon, after hours of mending linen and stitching insignia, one of them would prop the mirror upright. They would take turns standing before it, not to admire beauty, but to check if they still recognized themselves. The glass was fractured across the center, splitting each reflection into two halves, one from before the war, one from after. Red Cross nurse Margaret Willis, who volunteered at the camp infirmary, kept a diary that survives in the Geneva archives. One entry, dated February 14, 1946, reads, "They didn't look vain. They looked like people remembering they're still human." She described how a young POW named Ilse Becker brushed her hair with her fingers, tilted her head slightly, and began to weep. Not from shame, but from recognition. "For a second," Willis wrote, "she looked like a girl waiting for a dance, not a prisoner of war." The mirror became part of their ritual. They used it when fitting dresses, adjusting hems, or testing colors against their skin. But something else happened too. They began leaving messages scratched into the wooden frame. Initials, dates, even small drawings of birds and flowers. Over time, the frame looked like a carved diary of shared survival. One evening, as a storm rolled across Georgia, lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the women gathered around that broken glass. In that moment, their faces, multiplied by the cracks, looked like a mosaic of everything they had endured: youth, fatigue, hope, and grief intertwined. An American officer passing by stopped to watch. Later, he would tell his wife in a letter that the scene felt like watching people rebuild their souls from reflection. By then, the war was over. Germany was rubble. Yet inside this camp, these women were rediscovering what it meant to belong to themselves. Sewing had given them rhythm, thread had given them voice, but the mirror gave them something even more fragile, the right to be seen. Many years later, that same mirror would surface in a small estate sale in Tennessee, labeled Prison Camp Artifact 1946. A collector bought it for $15. If you look closely at its wooden frame today, faint beneath the varnish, you can still read 3 words etched in German. Ich bin noch hier. I am still here. How many of us, in our own way, are still trying to believe those words? In the summer of 1946, the trains began to move east again. One by one, the German prisoners were called by name, their numbers checked, their few possessions listed. Each woman was allowed a small package, a handkerchief, a photograph, and whatever personal item they had made in the camp workshops. For many of the seamstresses, that meant something simple: a spool of thread, a scrap of fabric, or a tiny embroidered cloth folded inside a pocket. At Camp Ruston, the final morning was quiet. The sewing machines had been disassembled, their hum silenced after months of constant rhythm. On one table sat a basket of leftover supplies: pins, lace, thimbles, and half-used reels of American cotton thread. Sergeant Reynolds watched as the women, now dressed in their best work clothes, said their goodbyes. Some hugged the nurses who had taught them English words like thank you and safe home. Others stood still, eyes on the fence line they had stared at for over a year. Before boarding, Erica Lindner approached Captain Ellison and held out a handkerchief she had embroidered with a small blue star. "For you," she said, "to remember that we were not only prisoners." He folded it carefully into his breast pocket and could only answer, "I won't forget." Years later, his daughter would find that same handkerchief in a family keepsake box, the thread slightly faded but still bright enough to catch the light. For many women, homecoming was not a return, but another kind of exile. Germany lay in ruins, food was scarce, and the cities they had left no longer existed. Yet they carried something the ruins could not destroy: skill, memory, and thread. In an interview printed in Neue Zeitung in 1948, one former POW, Lotte Weiss, said, "I held a piece of American thread and taught my daughter to sew. I told her, this thread once tied me to kindness." Some of their camp-made dresses survived decades later, preserved in museums or family trunks. Others vanished into the dust of ordinary life, worn until they frayed. But their meaning endured. Those stitches had connected enemies, transformed scrap into dignity, and turned captivity into a form of creation. In one final photograph from Ruston, taken just before repatriation, the women are seen standing beside their barracks, holding up a long piece of linen embroidered with the words, "Wir haben genäht, zu leben." We sewed to live. When the last train whistle sounded, a spool of thread rolled off a table and spun slowly across the floor, unwinding as it went. The light caught it, a thin silver line stretching between what had been broken and what had been mended. It was the same light that glinted off the rails as the train disappeared toward the horizon. Years after the camps were dismantled and their fences torn down, the sound of sewing machines still haunted the memories of those who had lived inside them. For the guards, it was the background hum of duty. For the women, it was the rhythm of survival, a heartbeat they could control when everything else had been taken. In post-war Germany, amid cities of ash and hunger, many of these former prisoners became tailors, teachers, or small workshop owners. Some made dresses for American wives stationed in Europe. Some mended the clothes of children who would never know what a prison camp was. A few, like Lotte Brenner, sent letters to their American supervisors, thanking them not for freedom, but for dignity. She wrote, "You gave us cloth, and we learned to make peace out of it." At Camp Ruston, the wooden barracks eventually rotted away. The sewing room became a grain shed, then a ruin, then a museum. On its wall today hangs a single framed artifact, a small square of fabric embroidered with blue script. Every stitch remembers. Tourists stop to read the caption, but most never notice the faint hum from an old Singer machine that the curators sometimes plug in for effect. It trembles softly like an echo of all those hands that once moved in rhythm. Their story was never about war or politics. It was about the human instinct to create, to repair, to connect. They had brought needles to a battlefield and turned them into instruments of memory. When they sewed for the Americans, they weren't surrendering. They were reclaiming the last freedom left to them, the freedom to make something gentle out of destruction. And perhaps that's why their story endures. It reminds us that peace is not declared by treaties or flags, but stitched quietly, one thread at a time, by people who refuse to let hatred be the final design. Some of those women lived long enough to see their daughters wear dresses they had once dreamed of behind wire. Others never left their small towns again. But wherever they ended up, they carried a memory that no war could erase. The feeling of fabric beneath their fingers, the weight of a needle, and the sound of creation rising softly against silence.